So I'm here today to talk about America's culture. Come on in, please. Hi, I'm Kea, not to name and shame you, but you can take whatever seat you like. Don't be shy. Today's going to be a little bit informal because I'm a little bit informal. I'm here to talk about America's culture of car dependence. I'm going to talk about what that means in a second and what to do about it, all in under 40 minutes, which is not enough time to talk about all this important stuff. But before we get into the meat of it, I always like to say a few words about who I am, in addition to that kind introduction, and also who I am not. This is where I blast my imposter syndrome out of the water, and I put up my wall of shame. So I'm not a built environment professional, and I think it's really important in our field that we listen to people who don't come at this from a position of knowing all the lingo. Some of you are learning the lingo right now. I'm going to talk to you like you know nothing for the most part, because that's what I do all day. I am someone who talks to people in the movement to end car dependence, which is not really just one movement. It is the intersection of movements to do things like end car crashes that cause fatal and serious injuries. It is at the intersection of movements to curb greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector. It's also looking at how we can reparate communities who have been harmed by racist transportation policies of the past, and on and on and on. I tried to make a 7-way Venn diagram. It didn't work out for me. So I have the really unique privilege in my day job of talking to these folks and writing articles 4 to 5 a week, where I think about the American transportation landscape from a lot of different angles. I get to have a little bit of a bird's eye view on it and also talk about the things that are a little bit more intangible. So before we get into that, though, I'm going to talk about what the movement to end car dependence is to me, but let's also talk about what that is not. So the movement to end car dependence is not the movement to ban cars. Has anyone seen that Twitter hashtag ban cars all over the place? Does anyone have the sticker that NumTots makes? Recommend that you look up NumTots if you haven't before. New Urbanist Means for Transit-Oriented Teens. It's actually an incredible resource for this stuff. When we talk about even banning cars from one specific place within the public realm, like for instance, this is a superblock in Barcelona. Do you guys know what a superblock is? All right, if you don't and you're shy and you don't want to just yell out, I don't know something, I encourage you to do that more in your day-to-day life. A superblock basically in like 6th grade terms are when you have like a big gridded street network and you close off a couple of perimeter streets around it and you ban car traffic within it. However, car traffic isn't actually banned in these situations. The movement to end car dependence is not saying we're not going to have any emergency services vehicles, no ambulances coming to get you, though there are lots of incidences where actually the work of an EMT can be done on a bicycle, sometimes better than in an ambulance. It's also not saying that we're never going to let people who use cars as a mobility assistive device access their homes. Of course it doesn't. It's also not the movement to ban drivers. I am a driver. Some of my best friends are drivers. I'm sure most of you at various points in your life are drivers. So yes, the news of the war on cars has been greatly exaggerated. When I talk about the movement to end car dependence, what I really mean is the movement to reorder our transportation hierarchy, which is about, right now, flip this upside down, the opposite of what we see here. The idea is that we want to prioritize the modes of transportation that cause the most benefit for the most number of people and deprioritize those modes that cause the most harm to the largest number of people. Notions of harm and benefit to whom should be our next question. We built our transportation network thinking that we were causing benefit to a lot of people. We created a system where we said everyone's lives would be better by driving, but we didn't include everyone in that everyone. And we have negotiations at the local level and probably in this room about what this means, and I would love to talk to you about this more in the Q&A. But this is one example out of Birmingham, the United Kingdom, where they said, we want to prioritize walking as our #1 thing. We want to prioritize cycling. E-bikes are second order. Would love to talk to you about e-bikes during the Q&A. So I suspect some of you kind of have an intuitive sense of this, but I always like to get some car dependency 101 kind of stats out in the room. This is a graphic representation of the way that Americans, by and large, get to work every day. 75.9% of them are driving alone in an automobile. 8.9% of them are carpooling. You can tell this is a pre-COVID graphic because 5.7 of them are working from home. And then we've got all these other categories like walking, biking, taxi, other, which is mostly people who are very confused about how this survey is conducted, who are so small that they all fit in this tiny little bit over here. And this is not sustainable for a lot of reasons. Geometric reasons, among others. Congestion is a major problem as we get into this in a city context. But let's talk about some of the negative externalities of a high car mode share that pretty much everyone seems to agree on. The first one, oh, sorry, I wanted to show you guys a little bit about city-specific here. Are you all from Massachusetts? Okay, I've got people from all over. So shout out if you see your city on this list. This is a chart that I threw together of how people, if you look at the metro areas around the world with more than 1 million people, which communities have the highest percent of what we call car mode share, people who are driving to work and other destinations via an automobile, and which ones have the lowest. The top 10, as you will notice, are all in the United States. Detroit is number 1 with 91%. Houston is tied, I think, or maybe like 0.5% down. And the lowest ranking 10 cities are all outside of America. Shout out to Tokyo and Hong Kong. I've been told that there's a student here who has lived in both of those places. This isn't even a total encapsulation of the problem, because the way that we tend to talk about, take measurements around car mode share is just about journey to work. What percentage of your trips would you say, just shout it out, are just a trip to work? Y'all are students, so probably pretty low. Don't raise your hand, just give me a number. 80%? Yeah, so it's a significant chance. Are there any people who are female identified in this room who want to give me the answer to that question?
Can you repeat the question, please?
The question is, what percentage of times when you leave your home are you going to work? 5, 6, right. There are demonstrated differences between the way that people of various demographics, be that gender, be that race, be that ability, where they go. We only measure in a systematic way how you get to work, what you choose to reach for, whether that's the keys, the Metro card, or the sneakers, I guess, as a stand-in for walking. There are a lot of problems when we have 91% of people in an American city trying to get to work by car. One of the big ones is emissions. So you'll notice around about, I think it was 2015, the transportation sector became the leading emission sector in the United States. And it kind of happened not with a bang, but with a whimper. You would think we would have gotten a reprieve from that during the pandemic. We're in 2020 here. We did, but transportation was still the leading source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And that's a really, really hard thing to change because Americans drive a little tiny bit more every single year. You might think that, well, we'll just electrify all of the cars. That's going to do it. Unfortunately, it's not, for a lot of complicated reasons, and I can talk more about these stats later in the talk. This is a study that I always like to reference when I give these talks from the State Smart Transportation Institute. If I ever use an acronym on a slide and you don't know what it means, stop me. I think acronyms are the devil's work, and I would really like to make sure that you know what I'm talking about. So these really smart researchers said, okay, we're not going to get to 90% vehicle electrification by 2050, which is what would be required for us to get to our climate and emissions goals and drive exactly as much as we do now. So let's say, how about we look at a couple of scenarios? What if we could get to 40% vehicle electrification by 2050? But red line is business as usual. We drive about as much more each year as we do, like we follow that rate, that trend line, pretty much to the letter. And the cars that are not electrified are changing in fuel economy at the rates that they currently change. We would miss our target by a mile if we went with the business as usual scenario. Then we went for the optimistic scenario, which is by 2050, America is going to drive 20% less. Vehicle miles traveled is what VMT stands for. We still miss it by a mile. There have been some other studies in the last few years that show that we would need to get about 80% of the trips that are currently happening in a car in America's, I think it's 15 largest cities, in order to get to those goals. We drive too much. There's no way around it. If we are going to meet our ambitious climate and emissions goals, this needs to change. Another way that cars are killing America, frankly, is, we just showed you the long-range picture. This is a short-range picture. It has to do with car crashes. Might not be news to everyone in this room, but car crash deaths have gone down precipitously since about 1975, which is when a fine fellow named Ralph Nader helped create vehicle safety standards in a comprehensive way for the first time. Almost all of those gains have happened within the car. The driver, the occupants, things like that. A funny thing started happening around 2010, around 2000, which is pedestrian deaths started to go up very, very quickly. And it was a mystery for a while as to why. I'm going to solve the mystery for you later. Car crashes kill about 38,000 people in the United States every year. To put that in perspective for you, it is the leading cause of death for children, which you might not know. When you add on the 20,000 people who are killed by pollution-related diseases specifically related to surface transportation, it becomes one of the top 10 causes of death worldwide. It's bigger than gun homicides. It's bigger than most forms of cancer, except for the ones that are most aggressive. It is the silent epidemic, is what we like to say. The silent pandemic, a little bit more accurately. And the pandemic and the car crash pandemic went hand in hand. Car crash deaths went up during the pandemic. Remember when none of us were driving? More people were dying. And particularly more people were dying among the pedestrian cohort. To drill down on this a little bit, the people who were dying were not distributed uniformly throughout demographic groups. If you are a white person sitting in this room, you have about half the chance of dying in a car crash over the course of your lifetime than a black person. You have about a third of the chance if you are an indigenous, an American, Indian, or Alaskan native. This chart over here is a little hard to read from where you're sitting probably, but it quantifies who is dying of pollution-related diseases, health disparities, relative to what they are causing with their mode choices. And Hispanics and blacks are the people who are most likely to die from inhaling pollution, from sedentary lifestyle diseases, from all kinds of things. This is unconscionable. This is something that we can change. Car crashes, all kinds of them, whether they are pedestrians or other motorists as well, are completely preventable. Has anyone heard that before? Okay, we got a couple. Does anyone not believe me? You can admit it if you don't. It sounds pretty far-fetched, but this is what we call Vision Zero. Vision Zero is the idea that we can end fatal and serious injury car crashes. It is not the idea that we can end car crashes, period. People will make mistakes. And what we need to do if we want to end car crashes is we need to build a world where mistakes don't kill you or disable you in a profound way. We're going to come back to Vision Zero later. This has been a very incomplete list of the ways that there are negative externalities associated with high car mode share, but one I always like to talk about is the way that Automobility Motordom, these are all synonyms for car dependence I'm going to use throughout the talk, erases the evidence of its own violence. So this right here is a monument to victims of traffic violence. That's what I call it when I talk about people who die in car crashes in Prague and the Czech Republic. Has anyone ever seen one of these in the United States? Not in the United States. You've seen this one. Love that. Has anyone ever seen a ghost bike memorial before, or a roadside memorial? That's the closest thing that we have, is ad hoc, non-institutionalized sort of memorials to people who die in traffic crashes. This is a big reason why I think we have come to accept either that traffic crashes are a cost of doing business, that it's something that we have to live with, even though the United States has higher car crash rates than almost any other industrialized nation in the United States, in the world, excuse me. But it also is something that is deeply traumatizing to families. I always like to, if you feel comfortable, raise your hand if you know someone. They don't have to be a close relative, just someone you've ever met in your life who has died in a car crash. Okay, almost everyone in the room. Has anyone ever been in a car crash themselves? Again, almost everyone in the room. Lower percentages here on the East Coast than there are in the Midwest. This is something that is infused into our culture. And the reasons why are complicated, and we're going to unpack them over the course of this talk. So I have one catchphrase, which I came up with under duress when I started a podcast, which is, what can you do today to help end car dependence? Because while you folks in this room are on your way to becoming built environment professionals, there are things that you can do today to help end car dependence, to put yourself on a path to living in a community where not every single person drives. We're going to return to some of those options later on in the talk. But the biggest thing that I want to impart upon you here is that car dependence was created, and car dependence can be dismantled. It was the result of many, many, many systemic forces that were perpetuated deliberately by powerful people over time. And we all had a part, and continue to have a part, in making sure that those systems are upheld. And if we want to end car dependence, we need to talk about what people explicitly and implicitly think about when they choose how they're going to get around. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a list. Another thing that belonged on my list of things I am not is graphic designer. I'm sorry, this looks like the Black Flag logo up here. I don't know. But there are kind of 5 main things that over the course of my career I've written a lot of articles about, and that I've noticed that people tend to refer to when they talk about their mode choices. And those things are road design and land use, vehicle speeds and behaviors, road user needs, proximity to care, and vehicle design. They might not use those words. They might think that some of these things are the same thing, because they are in a lot of ways. All of these categories influence one another, but they profoundly shape the choices that we make on a day-to-day basis. Let's start with probably the one you all are studying the most, which is road design and land use. So when you are going to the grocery store, the first question you ask yourself is what? Sorry?
What do I need?
What do I need? What am I bringing with me? So that gets into questions of cargo that we're going to talk a little bit more about later. Another thing that we talk about is, how far away is it? Is it on the end of my block, or is it 4 miles away? Am I going to Costco, or am I going to my bodega? You think about whether there's going to be a sidewalk along the path. A lot of places you can't rely on there being a sidewalk. You think about whether that sidewalk is good, and you might, or whether it bottoms out into a mud pit, especially if you're in a wheelchair or using some other assistive device. We might not have the language to talk about these things. We might not know things about mode-specific facilities and things like that, but we do sort of intuitively think about it as we go through our day, making our mode choices. And all of these experiences are highly, highly individualized in a lot of ways that we're going to talk about shortly. However, when I ask you, what are the things that make you decide, I'm going to drive versus walk, bike, or take transit, most of you are probably going to say something to me like, well, the drivers on the road are crazy, so I'm not going to risk it. I've been told that there have been some recent fatal car crashes on this campus. I'm curious, was speed involved? Does anyone know? Got it. Speed is the #1 determinant of whether you will survive a car crash. There are other determinants that we're going to talk about later. If you are struck by a driver who is going 20 miles an hour, you have a 90% chance of surviving that crash, unless you have serious health conditions. Older people, these stats start to change. If a driver is going 40 miles an hour, you're going to die 80% of the time. And speed is one of those behaviors that we tend to individualize. Who here speeds? Oh yeah, there you go. I don't think that anyone who raised their hand just now is a bad person. I don't think any of you necessarily are making a choice, because This goes back to that last slide that we saw, land use. And I like to demonstrate this with two very short slides. So I'm from St. Louis. Anyone been to St. Louis? Okay, cool. So you might recognize this place. This is Lafayette Square, and it's called Park Avenue. If you all could just shout out for me, what are some of the design features in this that might give you a clue that this is not a place where you can drive like you're on the interstate? A bike lane? Yeah, it's painted on. Not ideal, but it's something. Parking, specifically angled in parking, which is physically narrowing the width of these lanes. Anything else?
Cops.
Cops, yeah, we got two of those. There is a substation right there on the corner. Though I will say, I live pretty close to here. I have never seen someone get a ticket here, even once. I have never seen a police officer interact with a driver here, even once. They park here to get coffee, and then they leave, and they go to the next slide that we're about to see. Anything else we want to add here?
At grade intersections.
At grade intersections, vocabulary, love it. High visibility crosswalk, anything else?
Single lane.
Yeah, single lane in each direction. Bi-directional lane is important. Yeah, you don't have to raise your hand.
Pedestrian scale street lamps.
Exactly, street lamps and everything's at pedestrian scale. This is a line of shops and restaurants. Everything is signaling to you that this is a people place and not a car place, right? I've never seen someone go more than 15 miles an hour here. Design speed is powerful, and it's one of the single biggest predictors of whether people will make those mistakes that kill people. Let's contrast it with this road. What are the design cues here telling you to do? This is also signed for 25 miles.
Do a rolling stop here and not get pulled over.
Probably, yeah. Okay.
There's no parked cars along it.
No parked cars along it. There is parking, but nobody's parked. And this is where we're expanding out a little bit from the notion of design speed. This is a intersection of Hamilton and Theodosia Avenues, like any Lin-Manuel Miranda fans in the audience, which would be adorable if this weren't the site of a recent fatal hit and run that the pedestrian was never identified, and she laid in the street for 8 hours before she was found. And I think about her a lot. The reason why no one's parked on this street is often a matter of policy. This is on the north side of St. Louis. If you know anything about St. Louis, you probably know where I'm going with this. A lot of these buildings along here have either been demolished. There used to be a building on that corner that burned down. Or they are being demolished by time and neglect deliberately because they are land banked and they are owned by speculators. This is also about a block away from a major arterial with an elementary school, with a church, with a ton of street life, but you don't go over here very often. There are no eyes on the street, which is a term that you probably have heard in your classes from Jane Jacobs. There's a lot of things between these two images that are giving you different clues about how to behave. And there are also factors that are removing people from the street realm. You remember a few slides ago I showed that you have a much higher chance of dying in a crash if you are black. This photo was taken on St. Louis's north side. Does anyone know roughly who tends to live on north side St. Louis? 98% African American. Overwhelmingly segregated area. Park Avenue is about 80% white. And the prevailing theory about why we have so many BIPOC people dying in pedestrian crashes is not just because they walk more because they have less access to vehicles. It's also because we have more Theodosia Avenues in black neighborhoods than we have Park Avenues. We also have more grand boulevards. So this is another street pretty close, about a mile away from Theodosia Avenue, that showed up on 2 lists. It is one of the 40 most dangerous stretches of road for pedestrians in America. It is also the 7th most dangerous stretch of road for motorists, both of them. There was a study that I reported on last year that showed that the most fatal roads for pedestrians all had a couple of characteristics that were all the same. They were all at least 4 lanes wide. Most of them had adjacent land uses that would compel people to walk. People go to this Grand Grill all the time. People are riding the bus. There are bus stops all along. This is the most populous and popular bus route in the city. And they also often have billboards. That's like kind of a fun fact. They have design characteristics in common. And they are overwhelmingly, 75% of them, located in low-income neighborhoods. These things are correlated, and we need to talk about who lives there and who this actually affects. So y'all mentioned cops on the Lafayette, on the Park Avenue slide. You might be thinking, okay, well, we're just going to do a lot of enforcement in these areas. I regret to inform you that enforcement is not doing what we need it to do. We have a lot of money for cops in American cities. I'm from St. Louis, so you're probably not going to be surprised to know that I am not super crazy about the fact that police do traffic stops at all, even if they did work, because they can lead to violence against people of color, disproportionately. So, moreover, they don't work. This is a study that looked at data from 33 different states, and it concluded that high rates of traffic stops are not correlated with low rates of traffic deaths. And that is true in urban contexts, that is true in interstate contexts. And this matters as we get into our third category, which is road user needs. Because if you're a person of color, one of your needs is not to be killed by police. It's an important need that needs to be met. But there are so many other factors that we think about, and this is the stuff that you might shout out if I took a poll of the room, when we decide how we want to get around. We think about convenience. We think about, will this transit route, will like doing this trip on transit take me 3 stops and a transfer? Will it cost me more money? Or am I going to do it in a car where I know I'm going to have a free parking spot at the end and it's a pretty fixed cost in my budget? Access to vehicles and equivalent. Do I have an equipment? Do I have a car? Do I have a bike? Do I have the assistive device that I need in good working order in order to make this trip in the way that I choose? Someone mentioned at the grocery store, what am I getting? How much cargo do I have? How much do I need to bring with me? Am I shopping for a day or am I shopping for a week? And all this stuff is shaped around perceptions of mode dignity, whether you live in a community that thinks that walking is shameful, whether you live in a community that thinks that cars are something to aspire to. I think a lot of us lived in those communities. I certainly did. I grew up in a rural area primarily. And accessibility is a really major one. So I always like to, when I have a captive audience, bust some myths around how people with mobility challenges get around. Bureau of Transportation Statistics did a really fantastic study a little while back that showed that 40% of people who self-identify as having mobility challenges do not drive. A lot of them can't. A lot of them is because they have low vision. It's because they have seizure disorders. It's because they have mental health issues that make driving distressing, cognitive challenges that make driving impossible often. There's also the fact that a wheelchair accessible van costs $15,000 to $30,000 a year. So even those people who are using assistive devices that are really well served by automobility often can't afford them. And this has some pretty serious challenges as we expand the conversation out to land use. How much accessible housing is located in what we call a 15-minute neighborhood, a neighborhood where you can access anything that you need within a 15-minute walk, bike, transit route, right? Another user need that I always like to talk about is this study from Charles T. Brown out of Rutgers, where he surveyed specifically Black road users to ask them what their barriers were to bicycling, and he broke it into 2 categories, bicyclists and non-bicyclists. 2 stats stand out to me from this study. One is that the fear of traffic collision is universal. Who here bikes? Okay. Would you describe yourself as fearless? Okay. Are you scared when you do it, or are you feeling good? I'm seeing some strenuous nods when I say scared. This is a universal fact. But there are other things on this list. I'm a person who bikes primarily for transportation that I don't fear as a white woman. Number 4, fear of being stranded is something that kind of stood out to me, because when I'm stranded, I have a pretty reasonable expectation that people will help me. I live in a culture that has been acculturated to help white women and protect white women. I also have some pretty concrete privileges, like I have a husband who has a car with a bike rack on it who can come get me. I tend to bike in neighborhoods where there's a high density of bike shops, and I have the number for a mobile bike shop on speed dial if something ever happens that I can't fix myself. All these privileges come into play, and some of them can be addressed through land use and planning, and some cannot. But you need to be aware of all of them as you're trying to actually shift big numbers on this stuff. So on the topic of being stranded, I also like to talk about proximity to care. So we talked earlier about that woman who died on Theodosia Avenue, who laid in the street for 8 hours. Eyes on the street is an important element of the conversation when we talk about proximity to care. But another one is how close is the hospital, and is that hospital any good? So DOT actually put this out pretty recently. 20% of trauma deaths are preventable with optimal emergency and trauma care in the transportation realm. Another stat that I could have shown you about pedestrian deaths is that they wildly disproportionately occur in rural areas. That's a big part of why those numbers for indigenous people are so high, because they don't have access to someone to come save them very quickly. That said, the unfortunate reality is that in America, car crash deaths are becoming increasingly unsurvivable because of cars like these, right? So I just like to take a minute with this every day. So this is a stat from a shot from a local newscast where they got a bunch of preschool or elementary schoolers, and they said, why don't you just sit crisscross applesauce in front of this Chevrolet and keep stacking up until the driver can see you. And this is how many they fit. You can't really read this stat up here, but this is from a DOT calculator where they calculated the blind zones of a Ford F-150, most popular vehicle on the market, by the way. And they also calculated the aerial circumference of the average preschooler. You can fit 578 preschoolers in the blind spots of a Ford F-150 if you pack them all in like sardines. It's shocking. And it's legal, because the way that we tend to do federal motor vehicle safety standards is we talk about occupant protection. Everywhere else in the world, when you design a car, you have to, well, not everywhere else in the world, in Europe and Japan, and a little bit in Australia, when you design a car, you have to say, this is how likely this car is to kill a walker in the event of a crash. This is how likely this car is to strike a walker when it is turning, for instance. I just had a study last week that I reported on that showed that SUVs and pickup trucks, a category we call light trucks collectively when we talk about this stuff federally, are 3 to 4 times more likely to hit someone when they are turning specifically. And the reason why is all vehicle design, right? It's because those things on either side of the windshield, we call those the A-pillars, they block your view. It's because this car is lifted so high off the ground that you can't see things underneath it. And the other reason, this is just a little stat that shows you why the rate of increase for SUV-involved deaths and things like that. The other reason this is a problem is because when a large truck hits you, it is more likely to kill you for some pretty intuitive reasons. One is vehicle weight. When you get hit with something heavy, you're more likely to be hurt than when you get hit with something light. The other reason is height. So all the good stuff that keeps you alive, your head, your neck, your chest, your guts, you're likely going to be hit by a front end, flat, aggressive front end design, more so than when you get hit by a sedan where you're going to be hit at the legs or the knees. You're not going to be happy, but you're less likely to die. And this is all kind of bad news. Oops, sorry. I deleted a slide there. Because guess what percentage of cars sold last year were light trucks, pickups or SUVs?
A bunch.
Correct. Anyone want to throw out a percentage?
60%.
70.
78. Everyone is shocked. Automakers aren't making sedans. They get way, way, way more profit relative to the amount that it costs to actually make these large trucks, and there's no disincentive for them to do it. There's also a large market for them, which we can talk a little bit about culturally why Americans tend to prefer really big cars. So just to return to my very bad graphic for a while, if you are a dork for this stuff, you probably noticed that the 5 things that I outlined kind of roughly map on to what we call the safe systems approach. The safe systems approach is the approach that has achieved Vision Zero. Does everyone remember the term Vision Zero, the goal of ending fatal and serious injury car crashes? It's the way that cities like Oslo, Norway, Helsinki, Finland, Hoboken, New Jersey have actually achieved this goal or come within like spitting distance of it. Oslo, they had 1 fatality in a 12-month period, and it was somebody who crashed into a fence. So we tend to not count that one, though I think probably there are some design interventions that could have saved that life. The safe systems approach is really important, and this past January, just a couple of months, was the first time that US DOT said the only acceptable number of car crashes in America is 0. And it's really significant because a whole lot of the way that we do safety programs at the federal level do not treat car crashes, 0 car crashes, as the only worthy goal. States all over America are currently allowed to set safety targets that say this is like how many deaths we would ideally like to get to on our roads as we get safer and safer, but they can set those targets higher than the year before and still qualify for federal funding, and about 1/3 of them do. The safe systems approach is really important, but when we want to talk about mode shift, there are some problems with it because we're not just talking about how to keep people alive, we're also talking about how to get streets that are joyful to walk on, streets that people want to naturally use other modes other than driving. So to talk a little bit about my problems with the safe system approach as it is applied in America, by and large, I need to talk about cheese a little bit. I hate this metaphor, but it's like wildly popular within the traffic safety community. Cheese, I hate it. So the idea is the world is a little like a stack of Swiss cheese, and if we I guess wanted to like stick a finger through all of the holes in the Swiss cheese, they would all need to line up just right. We would need to have identical slices of cheese with identical problems. And you know, this is a well-intentioned idea because we do have layers, we should have layers of protection around our bodies when we are out on the road. If a driver is driving down the road and they look at a text message, which, by the way, please never ever do that. When you look at a text message, it's like if you're going 50 miles an hour, it's like closing your eyes for about 30 seconds behind the wheel. I digress. If that happens, that's a hole in the slice of cheese. So hopefully you'll have another thing. You'll have, you know, pedestrian automatic emergency braking on that car, and the person directly in the crosswalk won't be killed. Say pedestrian automatic emergency braking doesn't work, because it doesn't in a lot of common scenarios. Happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. Well, hopefully that driver is going kind of slow so that the car crash isn't fatal. If they were going fast, hopefully there is a speed cushion, cross your fingers. And if all else fails, hopefully there's a really good hospital. The problem with this, again, apologies for my really bad graphic design. I have like an MS Paint level of like competency with this stuff, is that there are really, really, really big holes in our slices of cheese. So, for instance, we have design standards. You know, you all are in planning, so you don't get to read. Have you all heard of the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices? Yeah, it's scintillating reading. No, it's not. It's 800 pages long. It is a document that basically prescribes how traffic engineers are going to use signs, roads, and markings in the public realm. An example of why the MUTCD is a little fucked up is that the threshold at which a traffic engineer is recommended to put in a signalized crosswalk is one of two things. It is, do 100 pedestrians cross that street in under an hour at any point during the day, 100, or have 4 people been struck and seriously injured there, can't be a minor injury, in the last 5 years. If it doesn't meet those thresholds, engineers say this doesn't merit a signalized crosswalk treatment. Think about the weight of that. Safe vehicles, we have lots of holes in that too. We have cars that have odometers that are set to go way over the speed limit in any American city, and that is something that automakers love to celebrate. Safe road users, yeah, it's great when we educate people on how to be safe drivers, but when we know all kind of collectively that if you hit someone, it will be treated as an accident by the legal system, or there won't be other forms of consequences. I'm actually not crazy about legal consequences for a lot of these things. We can talk about that more in the Q&A. That impacts the way that we drive, and it impacts the choices that we make on the road. Safe speeds. You saw what a 25-mile-per-hour street can look like in various contexts. Post-crash care. There are a lot of unsurvivable injuries. The other problem I have with the Swiss cheese metaphor is that it implies that the slices of cheese are all the same size and that we encounter them all at the same time, which is not true. The way that we tend to craft safety policy in the United States is we put things like safe road users front and center. We put educational campaigns, enforcement, really right at the center of what we do. And we get these notions like shared responsibility. It is everyone's responsibility to keep themselves safe on the road. The problem with that, I'm going to flash forward just 2 slides here, is coming back all the way to 1923. This was a campaign put out by the American Automakers Association that said the pedestrian may say that if he chooses to risk life or limb, it is his own affair, but it is not his own affair if he forces another citizen to be a partner in a serious accident. I'm saying this in my old-time movie voice because I think it's so silly. The jaywalker rarely indulges his willfulness at his own expense. If I am killed, that's an expense, right? Jaywalking is a concept that we invented. Specifically, automakers invented it in the 1920s to render the crosswalk the only area where there is a reasonable expectation that there will be some form of legal consequences, maybe if you were struck and seriously injured or killed. Safety is not a shared responsibility. At least it is not equally shared. If I am driving a vehicle that is capable of liquefying somebody's intestines if I'm going 60 miles an hour, I have a greater responsibility, I would say, than somebody who is a toddler crossing the street, right? We have things like the 94% of crashes are caused by human error. This is a stat that was just removed from the US DOT website after a lot of advocacy pushback. What they were showing was that 94% of crashes were caused by people making mistakes. Yeah, some of them were traffic engineers. Some of them were planners. What they were really saying when they looked at that data was they looked at all the crash data for the past however many decades, and they said, well, only about 6% of crashes were things like a tree fell in, on top of a car while it was in motion, like in the middle of a storm or something like that, or something changed in the built environment, or the vehicle failed, the brakes went out, something like that. Speeding, running red lights, all of that got attributed to human error rather than the design features that might precipitate those behaviors. Safe speeds, is the next thing we tend to lead with. Signs on poles not reinforced by infrastructure. Safe vehicles are getting to be a bigger slice of cheese the closer we get towards vehicle automation, or I should say automated vehicle technology embedded in manual vehicles, because we do not have self-driving cars, and personally, I don't think we ever will. I can talk about that more in the Q&A if anyone's scandalized. And safe roads tend to be way, way, way at the back of the slice, and we have things like those crosswalk guidelines I was telling you about before. The other problem with the safe systems approach is it doesn't talk about culture. So this is a still from a Dodge ad. And in this commercial, a dad is driving with his son, and he says, "Son, the most important thing in life is love." And then he does like a turn to the camera, and he says, "Just kidding, it's hot, nasty, badass speed," which I think is pretty telling of our culture. You couldn't show this ad on the air in the United Kingdom. You would be fined, because it is depicting a behavior that is illegal. It is depicting a behavior that is dangerous. But we put it in something called our America's Most Toxic Car Ads contest that we did, and it did not win. It is not the most toxic car ad. Culture is something that we have shaped, and just to go back to this slide for a minute, deliberately through the interference of lots and lots of powerful entities. So I mentioned that this slide on the left was put out by the American Automobile Association, I believe is what it was called at the time. It might have been the American Motorist Association back in the 20s. Fact check me on that later. They also had this newswire service that they were really proud of at the time, where underfunded local newspapers could write in and say, "Hey, we had this car crash. Could you write us an article about that car crash?" And they did, thousands of them. And all those car crashes were transformed magically into accidents. I have some problems with the word accident, and a lot of other people do too. So this is a campaign from a group called Families for Safe Streets. Have you all heard of Mothers Against Drunk Driving? This is like Mothers Against Dangerous Driving, of all things. It is primarily made up of bereaved parents of young children who were killed by traffic violence, but it's also open to survivors of traffic violence and all these things. Every one of these pair of shoes represents a person who was killed on New York City streets in a certain year. They have a Crash Not Accident campaign where they are trying to educate journalists who should not be doing this, by the way, speaking as a journalist. The AP style has advised against using the word car accident ever, unless it has been determined in a court of law that, in fact, a certain person was not responsible. Then you can say it was an accident. I don't agree with that either. I don't want to say that every car crash that happens on a US road is the result of a malevolent driver who wants to hurt someone. In fact, the vast majority are not. I don't want to say that every car trip that happens on a US road happened by choice. I think a lot of us think we're making choices when we're responding to conditions and systems that are set out for one another, for ourselves. I want to encourage you all, when you see the word crash, car accident in the common parlance, which you will see it everywhere after this talk, to correct them. Talk about why it's a problem. I gave you this catchphrase earlier, which is, what can you do today to help end car dependence? This is a very non-comprehensive list. I think there are things that all of us can do every single day, whether it's having those difficult conversations about what motordom is, what car dependence is, why it matters, why at this point in the climate change conversation, we do not have a choice about limiting our driving, and creating the conditions where doing so is not only possible and safe, but something that we want to do authentically. But we can also call our legislators to support policies at any level of government that increase access to sustainable modes and remove subsidies to unsustainable ones. You can follow Streetsblog USA and also Streetsblog Mass. We have an affiliate in the state for more information on when you should be picking up the phone to call a legislator. You can correct misconceptions about the potentials of EVs alone to curb climate emissions. Every car that is on the road should be electric, but not every car needs to be on the road. If you drive, please buy the smallest car you can. Like, please keep the sedan market alive. I just really want there to be sedans the next time I buy a vehicle. Bike, walk, and wheel as much as you can, and encourage others to do so. Write a letter to a journalist who referred to a car crash as an accident, and this one's important to me. Honor a crash victim and sit with the full weight of that loss. It is not an act of God when somebody dies in a car crash. It is an act of many, many, many human choices made over time, and the driver is just the last one. And often the driver isn't making a choice at all. They're responding to conditions. They're responding to vehicle features that are encouraging them to check out behind the wheel, do things, make mistakes. I want people to make mistakes and not die. I want people to engage deeply with their senses as they move through the world, which you can't do from behind the wheel of a car. Driving is often necessary. Driving is often a car is often the best tool for the job, but it's not the best tool for every single job. And I want to encourage all of you in your capacity, both as planners to be, landscape architects to be, and also just as full human beings who live in this world, to ask yourself this question every day. So that's what I got for you. Thank you so much for your attention while I blathered on and on about this stuff.